Duke Nukem 3D is, these days, a very dated game. Look, I'm going to get that out of the way right from the start, because a lot of this game was clearly aimed at the kind of teenage boys who pride themselves on having an edgy sense of humour. I know, because I was one of them at the time, and it felt very much like it was aimed at me. Besides which, that's not entirely a bad word. It's also dated in a very good way. The game is, frankly, utter nonsense from a physical perspective. Duke runs around at what seems to be 150 miles per hour, even before you press the key which makes you go yet faster. He shrugs off bullets, long falls and attempted electrocution. He holds his breath underwater for long enough to need a visa, and even sets off an earthquake or two with a surprising lack of intervention from any government agency. And while dated, I at least don't have to suffer the pain of trying to play a game which required a fast enough CPU for high resolutions and frame rates that it's a little difficult to emulate in its full glory. There are modern source ports, such as eDuke 32. And while this does add modern controls and very fancy per pixel lighting, it doesn't mess with the basic formula from all the way back in 1996. Duke 3D is fun, it knows it's a game, it believes that games are first and foremost supposed to be fun, and it throws its dated little 90s heart into it. The anarchic disregard for, well, basically anything which results is something I think a lot of po-faced cinematic modern games could benefit from. Maybe minus some of the humour.
Shake it, baby.
Which is, now I've made that disclaimer, not universally bad. A lot of the truly cringeworthy gross-out stuff and crude sexual references associated with the character come from Duke Nukem Forever, and while I wouldn't say Duke 3D is exactly subtle, the worst of the misogynistic stuff is front-loaded into the first two levels as Duke makes his way through the red light district. As you play further, you'll discover a game that is willing to riff on everything.
Born to be wild.
From pop culture to some rather nerdy science fiction deep cuts. It also misses that, as much as this is dated now, it was revolutionary at the time. First-person shooters, or to use the correct term for 1996, Doom clones, typically took place across abstract landscapes designed primarily for gameplay and showing off game engine effects. Protagonists were mute, apart from the occasional effort or manly grunt of tolerated pain. Formless entities that you only knew were a space marine or part of an elite group of special agents because the manual told you so. Interactivity with the game world was limited solely to those doors, items and secret compartments which would directly progress the game or dispense extra power-ups. Duke Nukem 3D was not anonymous and abstract. It tried to model actual recognisable places. It made Duke into the star of his own game with a huge number of one-line reactions to things going on in the game world, recorded by John St. John. And on top of this, it gave the game world an unprecedented level of interactivity. You could use a toilet, kick it off the wall, and then use the resulting fountain of water to heal your wounds. Just like in real life. We go through an awful lot of toilets at my house. Part of the trick was that Duke 3D's levels were just as gameplay focused as the more abstract efforts of its competition. Many of them are designed around a circular layout, where you start out going the long way round, but once you have a few keycards, or perhaps some explosives, you can zip across the map directly. This also makes for good multiplayer action, as the main parts of a level always have multiple places a player can arrive from or run to. I might have noticed and appreciated all of this clever design and sound gaming fundamentals at the time, were I not absolutely rubbish at this. First-person shooters were not my thing. They are still not my thing. I could just about scrape my way through the shareware episode of Wolfenstein 3D on the easiest difficulty, but when it came to Doom, I was struggling by the middle of Hangar. Rise of the Triad couldn't even get past the first level. And by the time I got a Duke Nukem 3D CD-ROM handed down to me a few months after its January 1996 release, I had firmly established my pattern for dealing with these games. find the God mode and all weapons cheats and play through them as a kind of omnipotent wish fulfillment. Which, after all, is what the character of Duke was designed for. Wish fulfillment for 14-year-old boys who wanted to imagine they defended the Earth from aliens, said cool things about arses and bubblegum, and even got to see some boobs along the way, rather than having to do boring English homework about boring books set during boring wars in which everyone seemed to die, apparently, of boredom. All of which would have diverted me for a couple of weeks, until the next game came along, were it not for the inclusion of something else on that game CD. The editor for Ken Silverman's build engine. Duke Nukem 3D's association with build was so strong that I vaguely remember Capstone Software making renewed attempts to hawk their earlier, worse build engine games in the hope some glamour would rub off from sharing code with the newer game. To anyone who bought William Shatner's Tech War as a result of this, I'm sorry. I'm not even responsible, and yet I'm still sorry. At least it can't have been many of you, as Capstone folded later in 1996. In this tiny remaining bit of interstitial space between Doom and Quake, the build engine was a really big deal. Even after the release of Quake in June, it was still a decently sized deal thanks to being much more friendly to older 486 computers. While some of the ability to replicate real-world environments was down to good level design and texture artwork, we didn't credit that as much as we should in 1996. It really did feel like the build engine was hugely more powerful than the Doom engine, even if it was in reality just a few extra tricks like sloped floors and the ability to change sectors at runtime. Build certainly offers a lot of tricks. One of my favourites is this submarine at the end of the prison level. It's not one submarine, but three. First you see the top half in the water, but water in Duke Nukem 3D isn't really water. Instead, when you drop below the surface, the game will teleport you to a new sector elsewhere on the map, which has yet another submarine, this time representing the lower half. Surface into that and you are teleported into yet another new location, this time the submarine interior, complete with button to end the level. It's all trickery, but when you played the game it felt like you were swimming into a submarine with a fully modelled interior, something other shooting games just didn't have. Perhaps the good level design and the editor weren't entirely separate concerns. One of the things you'll hear programmers talk about is the speed of their feedback loops. It's much easier to develop something if it only takes you 5 seconds to see if it worked. Whereas if it takes 5 hours, you've probably wandered off and forgotten what you were doing by the time you get to the result. Level editors in the early Doom clone era tended to involve a lengthy compilation sequence and then loading the level in-game to see what was going on. In Build, it was instant. You press enter, and you get a 3D view, almost exactly like the one you'll see in-game. I became obsessed with this. I'd messed around a bit with Wolfenstein 3D editors, but never done much more than put a load of dogs in a level because I thought they were cute. Build was something else. The ability to see what I was doing as I built a level was addictive. Like Will Wright's comments about his early level editors being more fun than the games they edited, I enjoyed making levels more than I enjoyed playing them. Levels which, by some freak of backup strategy, I still have some of. This collection appears to mostly be experiments, like putting sectors on top of each other and attempts to get things working rather than playable levels. It may have been the amount of Frontier I was playing at the time, but I seem to have had a particular fascination with building interiors for spaceships, especially this one, which came with a fully stocked bar and cocktails at the side of the pilot seat. Don't drink in hyperspace, kids. I also have the classic thing for any aspiring teenage level designer to have done: recreating their own bedroom. Yes, many years later we can explore the upstairs room of a chalet bungalow, complete with accurately unmade bed, 486 computer in the corner, and even the post-it notes I used to stick to the wall to remind me about the schoolwork I was supposed to be doing instead of messing around in level editors. You may notice that none of these efforts feature so much as a working door to operate. As I delved further into Build, I realised that beyond the simple act of making rooms, setting ceiling heights and choosing textures, was a lot of complexity. Build's features for modifying sectors at runtime to create those dramatic set pieces and moving vehicles involved special entities called sector effectors and sector tags. It used these for everything, even the most simple door, and it was easy to get things wrong, resulting in doors which warped the surrounding walls when operated, rather than creating a functioning opening. While Build came with a detailed README file, I found that many of the more complex features eluded me, especially the game's subway trains. This was still pre-internet for me, so there was no ability to look up an FAQ or post questions on a newsgroup. Instead, I bought a book. The very proudly unauthorized Prima Guide to the Duke Nukem 3D Construction Kit started with basic principles of level design and using the build engine, then built up to increasingly complex topics over the creation of a map called Castle. Being a somewhat budget-priced release, it didn't come with an included disc containing the map for you to look at. Instead, the book instructed you to visit a website using that internet connection you didn't have because it was 1996 and fewer than 10% of UK households had one. Like all things just tantalisingly out of reach, I became infatuated with CASTLE.MAP. I so wanted to play this one map that felt so familiar and yet I had never seen on my screen. And the sensible option here would have been to beg, borrow or steal an internet connection and download it, so of course I decided that once I had digested the entire book and knew level design inside out, I would make CASTLE.MAP myself, using the details hinted at in each chapter and the black and white screenshots thereof. I don't even know why. I wasn't any good at Duke Nukem 3D. I would be putting all of this effort into building my own version of this mythical level only to blast through it with the cheats on. Weirdly, for someone who runs a retro gaming YouTube channel despite seemingly not knowing how to record video or use a non-linear editor, I had a certain sense of shyness about this task. Imposter syndrome, maybe. I shouldn't tackle building CASTLE.MAP until I was good enough. Now, I would insert a training montage here of me building gradually better levels, but I really don't have that many of the files, so it's pretty much just this attempt at a pitched roof bungalow. Besides which, I want to show you Office.MAP. It starts in a strip club. These days, it's a very dated level. It was clearly aimed at, and indeed built by, the kind of teenage boy who prided themselves on having an edgy sense of humour. Yes, I totally used the game engine feature which lets you put in an alien having a crap. But while some of the worst of Duke's humour may have rubbed off on me, Office was also my attempt to build something which took on board everything the book had said to both show off clever tricks and demonstrate good solid level design, even despite never having visited an office and only having the vaguest clue what one looked like. Offices are, apparently, 80% fancy courtyard and fountains. But wait, this is approximating some almost nice level design. The pig cop and lizard trooper snipe at you from what looks like an inaccessible gallery, while a jetpack alien wanders around the open area. Maybe it would be slightly better if you couldn't just hang around inside the office doorway and take all of them down, but look. I wasn't very good at this game, and I designed the level around my limited abilities. Which is perhaps why this secret area gives you enough bonus items to make the rest of the level a pushover. Oh yes, an unusually well-lit warehouse strewn with tyres and a secret passage isn't the most imaginative end to a Duke Nukem 3D level, but it does at least function as some kind of generic workplace-themed extension, and there's a nice distribution of enemies, meaning you can get sniped in the back if you're not careful. I suspect this comes from a section in the Prima book, which talks about building a section of a level called Warehouse. I'm maybe not that original. So, with all the experience learned from building this, I came back to CASTLE.MAP and created my own version of... no. It seems my interest in Duke 3D waned toward the end of 1997, with the last files in my collection from November of that year, and even those only mildly tweaked versions of maps from earlier. By the time I got that internet connection, not only was Stereo's Duke Nukem 3D page offline, all of the ones mentioned in the book were down, had moved on to other games, or offered little more than a single-page apology that they were no longer updating. I still cannot find CASTLE.MAP. I have searched every collection of maps I can find, one with over 5,000 files in it. I have scoured websites and archives. I have combed through vintage shovelware CDs in the hope that someone, somewhere, had downloaded that map and put it on a disc in the hope of separating unwitting gamers from their money. I have opened many files called some variation of CASTLE.MAP, but none of them have been the CASTLE.MAP. None of them have had this layout, which would mark them out as the file I'm looking for. I have even tried to track down Joe Grant Bell in the hope some backup exists somewhere, but their contact details are as elusive as their map. In case you can't guess, this is a bit of a plea in the hope one of the few hundred or so people who will watch this video might have some useful lead on that lost level. Can I leave things there? On that downer ending? Well, not quite. Because in searching for that elusive map, I found the collective efforts of hundreds of kindred souls, hundreds of people who'd built their house or their neighbourhood or some other real-world location that they didn't really understand but thought would make a cool level. README files which credited the Prima Guide for the author's understanding of how the build engine works. I may have lost interest in Duke 3D by the time I had an internet connection, and so had most of the people who made these maps and ran the websites which hosted them. But I can still smile, 2.5 decades later, that someone in a patch of suburbia across the globe had a brief moment of shared experience. And isn't that, after all, a little piece of what we're looking for when we reminisce about these games?